This is not a story with a single hero, a single named soldier whose choice not to fire Haken, October 1944. A ruined stairwell, plaster dust still drifting in the gray light. An American rifleman of the 1st Infantry Division comes round a corner with his weapon raised, expecting another defender in field gray. Instead, there is a boy. He cannot be more than 14. He is wearing an oversized tunic, the sleeves rolled twice, and he is holding a Panzerfaust with both hands, the way a much smaller child might hold a fishing rod too heavy for him. For perhaps 2 seconds, nobody moves. The soldier's finger is on the trigger. The boy's finger is on his. Somewhere behind them, the fighting for the city goes on, indifferent, mechanical, loud. What happened in that stairwell, and in hundreds of others like it across the Rhineland and central Germany in the last winter of the war, rarely made it into official reports. Army records logged enemy dead and enemy captured. They did not usually record the age of either. What survives instead is a scattering of letters home, post-war memoirs, oral history interviews recorded decades later by veterans who had never spoken of it before, and the testimony gathered at war crimes hearings where the conduct of children in German uniform became, briefly and awkwardly, a legal question. From these fragments, a pattern emerges, consistent enough to be more than anecdote but never quite solid enough to be statistics. American soldiers, hardened by months or years of combat, describing a particular species of hesitation when the enemy in front of them was plainly a child. As come down to us with the clarity of the Charlie Brown and Franz Steigler encounter over the North Sea, a story of a German fighter pilot who declined to finish off a crippled American bomber and escorted it to safety instead. No equivalent single episode survives in comparable detail here, no photograph, no later reunion, no citation in a personnel file. That absence is itself part of the story. It matters because it says something uncomfortable about how armies choose to remember their own wars, and about what a fighting man is expected to do when the person trying to kill him is a child who has been trained, indoctrinated, and finally armed by a state in its death throes. It also matters because of what it says about the limits of the historical record itself. Armies keep meticulous account of ammunition expended, ground gained, and enemy casualties inflicted. They keep almost no account of conscience. A rifleman who chose to fire a warning shot instead of a killing one, who shouted a word of broken German rather than pulling the trigger, generated no paperwork. The war diary for his unit that day would record, at most, one enemy combatant encountered and dealt with. Whether dealt with meant a body left in a stairwell or a disarmed boy sent stumbling home to his mother was a distinction the paperwork had no space for. Historians reconstructing this aspect of the war are, in a real sense, working against the grain of the archive, hunting for a phenomenon the archive was never built to preserve. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht that had swept across Europe in 1940 no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Its officer corps had been bled dry on the Eastern Front, its equipment reserves were gone, its fuel supplies had collapsed to the point where tanks were being towed by oxen. What remained was scraped together from whoever could still hold a weapon. The Volkssturm decreed by Hitler in September 1944 conscripted every male between 16 and 60 who was not already serving, with barely a fortnight's training and often only an armband to distinguish them from civilians. Below that age threshold, informally and then increasingly formally, came the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth had never been merely a scouting movement. By the outbreak of war, it counted some 8.8 million members. Boys and girls drilled from the age of 10 in marching, obedience, and the cult of the Führer. As the war ground on, its paramilitary wings, the Wehrertüchtigungslager, established from 1942, trained boys of 16 to 18 on infantry weapons, grenades, and machine guns, ostensibly to prepare them for eventual conscription. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, raised in 1943, drew the overwhelming majority of its recruits from boys of 16 and 17. In its first battalion, more than 65% were under 18, and it suffered catastrophic casualties in Normandy that summer, most of the dead barely out of school. By the final winter, the age floor had simply given way. Boys of 13 and 14, members of the Junior Jungvolk rather than the Hitler Youth proper, were being issued the Panzerfaust, a weapon that required almost no training to fire and that could, at close range, disable an American Sherman tank. The scale of this conscription is documented with reasonable confidence. The psychological toll it took on the young conscripts, less so. What is well attested is the fervor with which many of them went. Survivors' accounts describe boys called up in the spring of 1945 responding not with dread but with something closer to elation, greeting mobilization orders with cries of relief that they would finally be allowed to fight, mocking teachers who wept as they read out the names. This was, after all, a generation that had known nothing but Nazi indoctrination since early childhood, for whom the Führer's cause and their own sense of purpose had been fused since before they could read. Whether that enthusiasm survived first contact with American armor is a separate and much less certain question. Training, where it existed at all, was rudimentary to the point of parody. One 15-year-old from Leipzig, sent to the front in the last weeks of the war, is recorded as having received barely half a day of instruction on the Panzerfaust before being issued an SS uniform and pointed towards the line. This was not an isolated failure of process. It was, by early 1945, closer to standard practice. Boys who had spent their childhood throwing dummy grenades and crawling under barbed wire in Hitler Youth exercises, treated at the time as invigorating outdoor sport, found that training repurposed within weeks into their only preparation for actual combat against the tanks, artillery, and infantry of a modern industrial army. The Panzerfaust itself made this appalling equation possible. Unlike a rifle or a machine gun, which rewarded training, strength, and steady nerves, the Panzerfaust required almost none of these. A single collapsible tube, a spring-loaded trigger, and a shaped charge warhead meant that a frightened, undertrained boy of 13, if he could simply hold the weapon steady and pull the trigger at close range, could destroy a Sherman tank and the men inside it every bit as effectively as a veteran tank hunting team. It was, in its way, the most democratic weapon of the war, and that democracy cut in a direction no one had intended. For the American soldier facing this, doctrine offered little guidance, because doctrine had never anticipated it. Rules of engagement in the United States Army in 1944 and 1945 were built around the uniform, not the age of the man wearing it. A combatant in German uniform, carrying a weapon and presenting a threat, was a legitimate target regardless of who he happened to be. No training manual instructed a rifleman to pause and assess whether the German aiming a rifle at him might be 13 rather than 30. In the chaos of house-to-house fighting, in the seconds available to react to a Panzerfaust leveled at a tank crew, there was rarely time for such an assessment even had one been mandated. The dilemma, where it existed, was not a matter of policy. It was a private, unrecorded moment of conscience, repeated an unknown number of times across an unknown number of towns, and resolved differently by different men in different circumstances. What can be reconstructed from the surviving testimony suggests three broad patterns of response, though the balance between them is impossible to establish with any precision. Some soldiers, under direct threat, fired without hesitation and without apparent afterthought, reasoning, reasonably enough, that a weapon aimed at them was a weapon aimed at them regardless of the age of the hand holding it. Others fired, but carried the experience for decades, describing in oral histories recorded 40 or 50 years later a lingering unease that had never fully resolved. and a smaller number, in circumstances where the tactical situation allowed it, chose to disarm rather than kill, to shout a warning, to fire past rather than at, or simply to withdraw rather than press an engagement against an opponent who was, self-evidently, a child. Accounts of American units near Aachen in the Ruhr Pocket, and later during the advance into central Germany in April 1945, describe encounters with Volkssturm and Hitler Youth defenders in terms that recur with some consistency: surprise at the age of the prisoners taken, disgust at the officers or fanatical SS men who had put them in the line in the first place, and a marked reluctance among the Americans, once the immediate tactical threat had passed, to treat captured boy soldiers as ordinary prisoners of war. Some accounts describe American soldiers disarming young Volkssturm conscripts and sending them home rather than into the standard prisoner pipeline, on the informal reasoning that processing a 14-year-old through a POW camp served no purpose. These are, again, individual recollections rather than a documented policy, and the historical record does not allow us to say how common such leniency actually was, only that it appears often enough in separate, unconnected testimonies to suggest it was not unique. The Ruhr Pocket, encircled and collapsing through the first 3 weeks of April 1945, produced a particularly high concentration of these encounters, if the surviving testimony is any guide. With well over 300,000 German troops trapped inside a shrinking perimeter and organized resistance disintegrating by the day, American units advancing through its towns and villages found themselves taking the surrender of entire Volkssturm companies, whose average age, by some soldiers' later recollection, looked closer to a school assembly than a military formation. Further east, in the final battle for Berlin itself, though that fight fell overwhelmingly to Soviet rather than American forces, reports filtering back through prisoner interrogations and captured German records described flak batteries and street barricades manned by Hitler Youth boys as young as 12, a detail that reached American commanders mostly as intelligence briefing rather than direct experience, since few American units fought inside the capital itself. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that by the last month of the war in Europe, an American infantryman advancing into German territory could no longer assume, as he might reasonably have assumed in 1944, that the man aiming a weapon at him was in fact a man. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Set against the German experience, the Allied use of underage personnel looks almost restrained, though it was not entirely absent. Britain's Home Guard, established in 1940, accepted volunteers as young as 17 for a home defense force that never saw the kind of frontline combat inflicted on the Hitler Youth, and its members trained on Sundays and evenings rather than being marched into contact with enemy armor. The United States, similarly, maintained a minimum enlistment age of 18 throughout the war, with underage volunteers who slipped through recruitment procedures being the exception rather than the rule, and those cases were treated as administrative anomalies rather than policy. Soviet practice, driven by the desperate manpower crisis of 1941 and 1942, came closer to the German pattern, with underage volunteers and the sons of regiments serving in various support and, in some documented cases, combat roles, though again the scale of this is contested and imprecisely recorded. The distinction that matters, though, is not simply one of age thresholds on paper, but of what each state was prepared to do once the manpower crisis became acute. Britain and the United States, for all the strain the war placed on their populations, never reached the point of arming schoolboys as a matter of formal national policy. Their systems of conscription remained, throughout the war, oriented towards adults, and the pressure of impending defeat never forced them to reconsider that line. Germany, by contrast, crossed it deliberately and openly, with state broadcasts and Hitler Youth leadership actively encouraging boys to volunteer ahead of formal call-up, treating early enlistment as a mark of honor rather than a last resort to be concealed. No Allied power, in short, matched the scale, formality, or desperation of Germany's final conscription of its own children, an act that historians have generally read less as a coherent military decision than as an admission that the war was already lost, and that the regime intended to extract every last possible defender, regardless of age, before the end came. It is worth noting, too, that the psychological calculus facing an American soldier in this situation had no real precedent in the Pacific Theater either, where the enemy, however fanatical, was almost never visibly a child. The moral weight of the European encounters was specific to this final collapse of the German war machine, a circumstance in which a state that had once fielded the most feared mechanized army in Europe was, within a matter of months, reduced to putting rifles into the hands of 13-year-olds and calling it a defense. The moral and legal reckoning that followed the war was uneven and, in places, uncomfortable. At Nuremberg and in the lesser trials that followed, questions of individual responsibility for atrocities committed by very young defendants arose more than once. In at least 2 documented instances, 15-year-old former Hitler Youth members were convicted of war crimes for their part in the shooting of a prisoner, with the tribunal treating their age as a mitigating factor in sentencing rather than a bar to conviction. It was, and remains, an uneasy precedent, an acknowledgement that a 15-year-old could be indoctrinated to the point of complicity in atrocity, and simultaneously that indoctrination did not fully absolve the individual. No comparable tribunal ever had cause to examine the conduct of American soldiers who chose to fire on, or to spare, an armed German child, because no law had been broken either way. The moral weight of those encounters was left entirely to the men who had lived them, to carry or set down as they were able. The legacy of this episode in the American memory of the war is thin, and that thinness is itself instructive. Where the destruction of the Hitlerjugend division at Normandy or the desperate defense of Berlin by teenage flak crews and Volkssturm units has been extensively documented from the German side, the American experience of confronting armed children has left comparatively little trace in official histories, which tend to record the tactical outcome of an engagement without dwelling on the age or apparent willingness of the enemy encountered. What survives instead lives mostly in oral history projects, veterans' memoirs written or dictated late in life, and the occasional passing reference in unit histories, a body of testimony that historians treat with appropriate caution precisely because memory, especially memory of one's own most difficult choices, is not a perfectly reliable instrument. It would be a mistake to claim more certainty here than the sources allow. What can be said is that the phenomenon was real, that it was widespread enough to appear independently in the testimony of soldiers who never knew one another, and that it left many of those who experienced it changed in ways the official record was never designed to capture. This absence has had a curious afterlife of its own. Popular memory of the American War in Europe has tended to fix on cleaner, more legible stories, the D-Day landings, the liberation of concentration camps, the link-up with Soviet forces at the Elbe, moments with clear photographs and clear meaning. The private moral arithmetic of a soldier deciding in a shattered stairwell what to do about a child pointing a weapon at him fits none of those narratives comfortably, and so it has largely been left out of them, surfacing only where an individual veteran, often very late in life, chose to speak of it at all. Documentaries and popular histories that do touch on the subject tend to treat it as a footnote to the larger collapse of Nazi Germany rather than as a subject in its own right, which is part of why so little of it has been gathered together in one place. Return, for a moment, to that stairwell in Aachen, the plaster dust, the 2 seconds in which nothing happens. We do not know, and can never know, exactly how many such moments occurred across the last winter of the European war, nor how many were resolved with a shot fired and how many with a shot withheld. We know only that they happened again and again in towns whose names have mostly been forgotten, to men whose names were mostly never recorded, confronting children who had been trained since the age of 10 to believe that dying for their Führer was the highest purpose a German boy could aspire to. Some of those boys were killed, some were disarmed and sent home. A small, unknowable number were, in effect, forgiven on the spot by soldiers who had every legal and tactical justification to kill them and chose, in that instant, not to. There was no medal for that choice, no citation, no reunion decades later filmed for a documentary crew. There was only the private knowledge, carried home by an unknown number of American soldiers, that somewhere in the ruins of a collapsing Reich, they had looked at an armed enemy and seen before anything else a child. That is not a story of a single soldier and a single boy. It is a story of a war that had, by its final winter, run out of grown men to fight it, and of an army that had never trained its soldiers for the particular cruelty of what came in their place. In the end, the German war machine spent its own children in its final months, one Panzerfaust and one stairwell at a time, and on the other side of that exchange stood men who had to decide, alone and in an instant, what kind of soldier the moment required them to be.